Hey guys, I'm back again with Robert Plank. I mean, we have known each other for so long. I've been a guest on your show a couple of times. You've been a guest on one of my past shows. So it's so much fun to have you back. You're always such a giver of content and you have so much good energy. So I'm glad to touch base with you again.
Glad to reconnect. I miss marketing in Merlot.
I know.
The show's gone, but the people are still here, so we still can have the witty banter.
Yes. So I know I need to connect with Lyndsay again. We used to do that fun video show and drink wine and talk marketing. It was a good time.
Do like the reunion show or something? How they
totally,
bring back old TV shows like the X-Files, bring back marketing in Merlot for just a short span of time.
I know. I'll have to bug her about that. But what I want to talk about today is you recently wrote a new book, so congratulations on that. And it's called WWHW Why, What, How to. There you go. What if? So easily create a book, podcast, or online course in just a few easy to follow steps. I mean, who doesn't love easy?
Right. It says it twice in the title even. That's how easy it is. It's double easy.
And so obviously it's created for people who are tired of waiting for motivation. My dog just ran up. Realize their willpower is unreliable and they want to take action and get results. And you do get writer's block, right? I mean, you're a podcaster, you're a content creator. Like, do you ever feel stuck? Is that where this book kind of was spawned from?
I do. And as you know, sometimes it can be one of a number of reasons why you get stuck. And it doesn't mean that you have to stay stuck. You can do things to change the channel and like kind of look back with a different perspective. And you know that sometimes you really dread thinking of a podcast idea or coming up with content. But then sometimes when you get just the right idea or you get some inspiration or you like connect or talk with someone else, you can suddenly like reignite the spark and have fun again. And I think that what held me back for a long time was not seeing the patterns. Like you go and you say, oh, Gary Vee put out this cool episode, but what does that mean for me? I don't want to just directly copy him, but then like, how do I make something that's fresh and unique? And so by looking at the patterns, the formulas, you can say, oh, here are the boxes that they ticked. So now if I just kind of tick some similar boxes or like use a similar like format structure, then I can kind of go from the burnt out boredom writer's block into having a really cool hook, a really cool idea and be like itching and excited to click the record button and start talking already.
I know. And that's so true because sometimes, and I love to write. And so some people love to like just talk and do videos. Some people are more comfortable with podcasting. And sometimes you do just like, oh my God, what am I going to create? And you just don't feel that inspiration. But then sometimes it's like, you know, I'll hear something or see an article or read something and I'm just like, oh, that's so juicy. I'm like dying to do a podcast episode of it or talk about it or write about it. But you can't always wait for that spark or that inspiration. It's hard. And I obviously interview, and so do you. But I have done a solo episode and I will be doing more. But I mean, some podcasts that's it. It's like, you know, just episodes of them. And so I just want to say that this is a great conversation for those people that, you know, need to create more content for their own podcast. So you have like a system. So can you kind of like step us through it for those people that are like, I need to create more podcast episodes. What do I do?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I think that one little nugget to like jump in here is if I'm feeling really stuck, I think about the people, right? I think about who themselves is stuck, however you phrase it, who is stuck without this solution. Because instead of just saying, well, here's 5 ways to do something or 5 tips, that's boring. But if you think, okay, here's Lyndsay out there who doesn't know how to schedule social media or something like that. You think of like what specific person, who of my customers am I like an exact specific person? Right. You don't have to like mention their name in your content, but just like have in your mind, this person is stuck. This person has this problem. And even just jumping in, starting with that idea of like problem solution, instead of just saying, well, let me put the words on the page, you think, no. who's stuck, what would their question be to you, and then what at the end is the answer. So that way, you know where to start. You start by kind of unpacking their question, and you know when you finish because you've answered what their question is. And so, you can also, because you need maybe like 20 minutes of content, you can have some fun with it because you don't want to just jump into the answer, right? You don't want to just jump into the steps, because then it's like, well, I don't even know if I'm in the right place. And so we kind of have a little bit of like, we have like kind of the window dressing here. So as you said, the structure is why, what, how to, what if. And when I was a little kid, I used to want to jump into the how to, right? I used to want to say, here's 10 steps to schedule your social media.
I'm that way.
yeah. We're just like, just give me the good stuff, give me the juicy bits. But then not everyone is that way, right? They want to know the why, they want to know the what before getting into the how to, before they fully understand it. And even when they get to the how to, you don't want to just leave them hanging. You want to get to the what if. So this whole WWHW thing is, you start with the why, you start with what is the problem, what led them to listening to your podcast or reading your blog post or whatever your content is. Why are they here? What's the problem? But then you don't just jump into the answer. You kind of explain the what. You explain what tools would you use to solve this problem? What are the keywords, terms, jargon, principles, and maybe even throwing in some of the alternatives that they've tried, some of the things that have not worked, that they've been frustrated with. And you say, well, here's the problem, and here's one way to solve it, and that doesn't work. And here's another way, and that doesn't work for this other reason. Now, here's Captain Lyndsay's solution to leveraging your podcast. And so then it transitions into the how to, the what if, the steps, and you say, here's what we're going to do, and here are the steps I'm going to walk you through. And let me walk you through the steps. And once I've done that, let me recap the steps, and let me tell you what we've done. And you have, as you know, you have a little bit of repetition to make sure that people understand it. And so now that you've taken on this whole journey, you said, here's the problem, here's the tools you use to solve it, here are the steps to solve it. You then get into the what if, and you get them excited about the possibilities, the next steps, now that you've had this easy win, now what can you accomplish from this point on? Now here's a checklist of everything we just talked about, so that way you can have it on an index card. Now here's a call to action. That way, now that you've gotten a little bit of a taste, now you can go to leverage your podcast, and you can go and book a coaching call or buy this course. And so once you kind of see this pattern, you start to see it everywhere. This why, what, how to, what if, and it works, as you've been saying, in a blog post, in a podcast interview, in a solo podcast, and it makes it so that way you appeal to all these different types of brains out there, and it makes it so that way it excites you to even answer this problem, and it jumps in, and there's no extra fluff. Plus, once you have gotten through the whole gamut of this, now it's time to end it, so that way your podcast interview or your blog post is not longer than it has to be. So it solves a lot of problems. Why, what, how to, what if.
That is so smart. I've never thought about it that way. So that's actually going to be super helpful for me when I do my solo episodes, because I'm totally how-to brained and just like, okay, here's the problem. Let's dive into the answers. And also, and then you think, okay, you've given your how-tos and you're like, oh, snap, the episode's only 12 minutes long. Like, it needs to be a little bit more meaty. So that framework really, it makes it more well-rounded, and you've created that hook to kind of pull them in more so. I love that.
Yeah. And because of, you think about how, like, people like you and me, we want to educate people, but they also want to be like entertained, and they also have their own hangups and their objections, where if they're listening to you about podcasting, you're saying all this cool stuff, they're thinking, well, I can't do it for this and that reason. And so you can kind of be teaching more in like a copywriting or like a marketing way of, instead of being like, well, welcome to school, and here's lesson one, you're kind of working on them, and you're kind of encouraging them and kind of talking them into taking action while also sneaking in the learning. So it's kind of, you're kind of playing a little bit of a chess game of your own.
Yeah, that's so good. And it's nice to have a framework so that you're not like you're just staring at this blank screen going, where do I start?
Yeah, exactly. And we've all been there where sometimes you read a blog post or something and it's just not written very well and you really don't like it and maybe you don't even finish it and you're not sure why. And it might be because, and usually now that we're aware of this,
Yeah.
sometimes people have this in the wrong order.
Oh,
Sometimes they'll kind of go on and on about the possibilities at the beginning and you're like, well, wait a second, I don't even comprehend what it is that you're
mm,
trying to teach me. And so yeah, it's and then it becomes kind of fun to talk about the problem and kind of just like really sort of sell the problem and explaining them like you're hurt because of this, you're frustrated because of this, and then it helps you because it draws people in, right? Because if someone if has tried creating a podcast and they're thinking about are their problems, if you're talking about the solutions without really relating to them a lot, then
right.
there's that disconnect. So it's like, hey, I feel you, I understand you, I know you've gone through all this, I've gone through it too, let's talk about it. Okay, now that we've gotten through that part, now let's talk about the solution.
That's so good. And is there a certain weight, like, if like a quarter of the what and a quarter of the why and like a quarter of the how to, like, because sometimes I find that like some podcast episodes or even blogs where it goes into the why for like forever. And I'm like, for the love of God, get to the point. And then all of a sudden, like the how to, like the meat is like just a little bit. And I was like, oh, like I kind of feel ripped off.
And that, I mean, that depends on how you want to do it, right? It depends on your personality. It depends on,
True.
is it a quickie podcast episode, is it a long podcast episode? And what helps me is to sometimes draw like a little doodle or a little diagram, because that way I can play it by ear and I can choose how much I want to unpack. Because it's like, say you're going to record, and here's a fun exercise. Say you're going to record a podcast, and say you just like, I don't know, you had some kind of doodle in front of you, right? And
Yeah.
you drew like some boxes and some arrows, and you can decide based on how you're feeling in the moment of how, like, do you want to just like show or be talking about your little box and arrow diagram and keep on explaining the why and like drawing it out, and then just give them a little bit of a taste and then say, okay, now you have to go buy my course. You could do it that way. Or if you wanted to be more teaching hands-on, like if it was a live in-person workshop or like part of a course or something, then you can be really quick on the why and then like kind of dive deep into whatever it is your diagram is. And so just based on whatever type of content you're creating, you could
Mm,
talk for 5 minutes or you could talk for 2 hours, just depending on kind of, like you were saying, if you have this mindset of what percentages of each one that you do.
right.
And it mostly revolves around like how big the how-to portion is, right?
That's true.
And it's like, you want to have it mostly how-to, that's more like an instructional. But if it's very little how-to and it's all this other things of the lead up, that's more of like your free content, podcast, sales letter, webinar, fun stuff like that.
That's a good point. I never thought about it that way. Um, and so when you're creating content, like, do you apply this to like video, like everything?
Everything. And the times that I don't apply it, or when I make it too complicated, when I'm thinking, oh
Mm,
man, I want to have this book and I wanted to have like 17 chapters and every chapter unpacks 20 ideas and I never even finish the outline. But then if I say, I'm making it too complicated, let me just get it back to why, what, how to, what if. And another kind of helpful kind of like mini idea here is to think of if you can word each of these sections as questions, right? So if you're saying, I'm going to make an episode about how to leverage your podcast, instead of just saying, well, let me talk about the why or the what, even if you wrote down in your notebook just for yourself, if you wrote down, why would I even want to leverage my podcast? And that's a simple tweak, but just as an idea of you have a question in front of you just for that section, and
yeah,
it's worded as if someone is asking you.
right.
And then that way you're like, oh, I can't help but answer that question. So why would I even leverage my podcast? what does it mean to leverage my podcast? What kind of platforms are out there? What kind of tools? And then how do I leverage my podcast? Now that you know that you should, and now that you know what we'll be using, like what are some steps to go from I don't podcast or I only have the audio recording into now I have all these results from it. And then at the end, what if I leverage my podcast? Well, now that opens up all kinds of opportunities because now you're posted in all these situations. So even just something like that. And I guess the whole goal of what you and I are talking about is getting past writer's block. So there's just all these little ways where you can almost like trick your mind into saying, I don't know what to write, don't know what to talk about, but WWHW, you draw your little doodle, you have these mini questions for each step of the way, and then it gets past the overthinking, over planning. So yes, I use it for everything because it works for everything.
Nice. And it does make it more, when it's formulaic, you're right. You're not overthinking it. You're like, okay, I want to write about this. Now I just need to, brain dump into these 4 blocks. And then you've got like a framework in front of you, and then you can rhyme off anything for your podcast episode.
Yeah. And if you're missing any, if one is weaker than the others, if one is too big, and then even the way that we're talking, one transitions into the other. And so there's not even like really like a break in your content. And so we were mentioning a few times about like starting off with a hook and really grabbing them and keeping them excited to the end. Copywriters call this a Bucket Brigade. So it solves a lot of problems all in one.
Nice. Now, what are some of the mistakes that you've seen that I call them solo hosts or solo podcasts that they make, or how they can improve their game?
Well, I think that quantity leads to quality. So you always hear that statistic of like the average podcast dies after 6 episodes. And so
it's crazy.
And it's terrifying. It makes me not want to be one of those statistics. But also
Don't be a statistic.
Yeah, but when you know people, and then just the way it's so easy to get distracted and to discourage yourself, and it's so true. And one trick that I have, I don't know where I learned this, but what you do is you go to YouTube, you search Gary V, since we mentioned him earlier. You search like some huge YouTuber.
Yeah.
Well, let's say Gary V, and you sort Gary V's videos by the oldest first. Have you ever done something like this? Like looked at some popular YouTubers, like original content?
I do, but I usually look at which videos got the most views. So then I know that those topics clearly are hot.
Yes. And that's good just to see. And you make one more click and you can sort it by that way. But it's sometimes fun while you're there, while you're on that screen, just out of curiosity, you look at, say, Gary V's first videos, right? Mm-hmm. Tim Ferriss's first videos, and they're so young and they're so awkward. And it's really encouraging because you're like, whoa, if Gary V went from that and grew into what he is now, then the lesson is you just need to create some things. You just need to record some content. Don't worry about getting it right. Mm-hmm. Don't ever record a podcast and say, oh, I'll throw the whole thing out and I'll start over. Just put it out as is, because on the internet, content is disposable. I mean, a Twitter post, but then there's a million more where that came from. And so I think that there's a lot of things that solo casters could do better, but I think the number one thing is like just create a quantity of episodes. Don't overthink it. Put out what you have, because by doing it, you'll get better just automatically by putting in the time.
That's so true. And honestly, when I first started podcasting and doing videos, I was freaking petrified and felt sick to my stomach. And then I happened to see 𝗪𝗫, who's like perfect in every way.
She's so polished, yeah.
I know, right? And you can't expect to be, like have that kind of production right off the bat. But she shared one of her first videos and just kind of like going back in time. And it was literally like her computer on the kitchen table. And she's like, I think there were kids running around or something. And I'm like, okay, clearly she started off like where I was. So it's like, if she can do it and progress, then everyone starts somewhere, right? So just kind of like, just dive in.
Yeah, everyone focuses on the wrong things. The production quality is great, but that's a nice to have, not a must have. It's like it's a cherry on top. Once you figure out like start putting out your episodes, start getting some traction, start making some money from it, then you can justify a better camera, better microphone, better lighting, all sorts of decorations. But yeah, I'm sure you see this all the time. People just setting up a whole super fancy set and then hardly ever using it or not using it at all. And a couple of years ago, I saw some podcaster interviewing Tony Robbins, and Tony Robbins was just like sitting in his backyard, and he had the iPhone like earbuds in his ears, and it was like running down. And I was like, it looks so homemade, and it's Tony Robbins, but it still works. And it did not make me say, oh, well, I will only watch Tony Robbins content if it's like super polished. It's like, if the person is good, if they have good information, then no one's going to shut off a podcast just because the camera is not 100% perfect.
That's true. And I know for me, like, I would rather listen to something where I know the person is authentic and their tips or their strategies, like, it makes sense to me and it's going to help me. That's all I care about. And so when I produce content, I try not to get hung up in like, how do I sound? What do I look like? And all that crap. But it's like, okay, if my tips or my guest tips can help somebody new in podcasting, then I'm like, then that makes me happy. I don't care about anything else.
Yeah. And with podcasting, sometimes there's the unexpectedness anyways. There's even if solo cast, but also with the interviews, sometimes you're going off into weird tangents and you'll have some ahas like right then and there as you're recording. So why wouldn't you want to share that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And real quick before moving on, like, one of these ahas that you're reminding me of is I was talking to some podcaster like a couple of years ago, and we landed on this topic of for a while I dreaded podcasting, like us interviewing us right now. I used to dread it, and I didn't, and it took me all this time to like uncover and dive deep into my psychology and figure out why. And it was that I wanted to have like a perfect conversation every time. And so I was so nervous about having a perfect conversation, about saying like just the wrong thing, because maybe I'll say something that kind of offends Captain Lyndsay, and that now she doesn't like me. But it clicked at some point, and I was thinking like, well, I might say something that I think is bad in some way, but the other person likes it. Or I might say something I think is like really smart and clever, but the other person is not impressed. So you don't even like, there's your opinion, there's your judgment, but you don't know how the things you say will come across. You might say something that you think is ordinary, and the person listening is like, oh my gosh, that is so helpful. That's like a really smart thing that I just heard. So you don't know. And so don't pursue perfection. Just like you said, have the authenticity.
Yeah. And that is so true. And like, I fumbled on words and said the wrong thing, had to backtrack or whatever, or the guest. And then afterwards are like, should we do that over? Do we need to cut that part out? I'm like, it's really fine. Like, I'd rather listen to someone that's a natural, normal conversation, like two people are just chatting about something they love, than it be like full on scripted and like starchy.
I'm the same way.
For sure. So speaking of your framework, how detailed do you need to get? Because I know some people actually create like a full-on script for their podcast episodes. And to me, I'm like, holy Hannah Batman, that's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work, and I think that's too much. And I do a couple of shows, and I have one show that it's the news for some small town in upstate New York. I don't even I live in California, but I do like a weekly podcast of like local news there. And that's I have a person cool. that it is, and the person scripts the whole thing, but then I'll be reading some big long paragraph. I'm like, I'm just going to jump to the end of that paragraph. Like, even for me, when it's scripted, I only follow like half the script, if that. Yeah. And I think that it's adding unnecessary work for yourself. And I think I think for the most part, even just like 3 to 6 talking points, and just to go through these different little phases here. And if nothing else, even just have, like we said before, have your why question, your what question, your how to question, your what if question. And if I'm really worried about running out of content, right? If it's like a podcast, a solo cast, or it's a book chapter, then I'll have these 4 questions: the why, the what, the how to, and the what if. And then I'll have 3 keywords next to it. So for example, like if we're talking about leveraging your podcast and I say like, what can you do to leverage your podcast? I might have like 3 little keywords saying like video clip, social graphic, tweet. And then that way I'll have some little helpers to help to answer that question. But that's as detailed as I will go. Just a question for each of those little sections, and then 3 keywords just to make sure that I have some answers for those questions. But any more detailed than that, or getting too far off the deep end, it's shooting yourself in the foot. And it's the reason why this framework exists, because everyone else makes it too complicated. So don't do that to yourself. Simplify it.
I love that. And you do say like create an episode in 5 minutes. So if you're creating a simple framework that takes literally 5 minutes and then you record, you're golden.
Yeah. And I mean, you just figure out what are those 4 questions. What's the why, the what, the how to, the what if, and figure out some of those 3 keywords for each question, hit the record button, decide that you'll go through each one in maybe 90 seconds. And then there you go. There's your 5-minute episode right there.
I know. And I find I have in the past made the mistake of writing too much out, or if I'm speaking and doing a presentation, and I find it actually stops me. Like I get stumbled up on my words because I'm like, oh, I missed a sentence, or I get lost on where I was, or like it trips you up sometimes. And it's like, if you know your content and you know your topic and your expertise, if you have those, like you said, those little keywords, that'll be like, oh yeah, I need to talk about, videos, and I know about videos. So like blah, 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 blah. And I'll just ramble on about my thing. But at least if I have those words to just like trigger, oh yeah, bring that up. Oh yeah, bring that up. And it just makes it super easy just to glance. So it doesn't look like you're reading off of a teleprompter.
Well, yeah, and you're reminding me of when I do webinars, because like this is all really similar, right? Podcast, webinar, a video sales letter, blog post. It's not that different, and that's why the framework still works. But when I do a webinar, I like to keep it just under an hour, because I don't want to go for like 90 minutes, 2 hours. Like I want to be an hour, but then I'll overthink it, and every time I overthink it, I'll make like 30 slides, and I'll be like, if I only make 5 or 10 slides, then I ran out of things to say. And so I'll make the mistake of having like 30 slides, and then I'll start the webinar, and like, I'll be like 20 minutes in it, and I'll be on like slide number 2 still. And then I'll find myself usually just like skipping over like 20 slides just to say what I wanted to say anyway, or like, rushing through what there is. And like, that's a weakness of mine, is kind of over planning and then not really using what I plan for, because I need kind of that comfort, that security blanket of thinking, well, I need to have some like really good content ready and like a really good surprise there. And it's like you're saying, like if you know your stuff, if you're an expert in this topic, like once you get rolling, it's hard to get you to stop talking. So don't overthink it. You don't need a plan that much. It'll just stress you out more.
Absolutely. I'm all for less stress and less work and more impact.
Yeah.
Can you kind of go into that what ifs? Because that part kind of intrigues me, because I never really thought about adding that in.
What if means, I mean, it applies in a few different contexts, right? And so for like a book chapter, you think, well, if I'm on like chapter 5, maybe I can set up chapter 6 a little bit. And the what if, as we said, it can express itself in a couple of different ways. If you are teaching a module of a course and you're saying, here's how to set up your Twitter account for auto posting. Well, throughout that video, you went through a lot of steps, right? You'd say, get this software, log in this way, set up your schedule, make a content calendar. You went through a lot of stuff. And if someone were to say, okay, I've watched the video, now it's time for me to take action, they'd have to skip to like minute 5, minute 15. So imagine if you just figured out like a 5 to 10 step quick checklist and said, do this, do this, do this. So that's one manifestation of this what if idea, is I've taught you some things. Now what's the next step for you? Like, what do you do
how
next?
to implement it?
yeah, how to implement it. And then another another approach that you could take, and because here's the thing is you have choices, right? You have freedom of how to apply these different buckets. So if you were doing like a podcast, then maybe your what if is to get somebody excited about all the different ways this could be used. So you say, leverage your podcast, do this on social media, but you could say something like, well, now we're showing you how to leverage your podcast, but imagine if you reuse this tool to get your own social media clients, or imagine if now you were able to like hire Lyndsay's team, and now you can have like 3 podcasts. Like you're spending all your time just on one show. You could just show up and do all this cool stuff. So it's like, get them excited about all of these possibilities in front of them. And I think that kind of to put it all in one ball here, this whole what if idea is, how do you end something, right?
Yeah.
And there's always the temptation to say thank you, right? I've taught you all this stuff, and now it's the end of my speech. Thank you, please clap. That's really lame. That's kind of not a very original way to end what you're talking about. But if you end with this idea of a call to action, and if you say, I would encourage you to like look into leveraging your podcast, or now that you know how to automatically post on social media, imagine how much more reach you'll get. Now you'll have all this engagement, all these customers, all this time freed up. So the what if is really powerful. So that way you do not end on a thank you.
I love that. I will end this on a thank you, though. I appreciate all your awesome tips. And I will definitely be using your framework for my next solo episode, because it makes my life easier and it frames it better for a more impactful episode. That was super helpful. So how can people get the book and dive into your podcast and find out all about Robert Plank?
You can find me and my podcast at marketeroftheday.com. We have over 860 episodes. And the reason is because we have this framework, and it makes it super easy, where we don't have to have a lot of preparation. We don't have to do a pre-call. We just jump in. We do all these interviews with people from all walks of life. That is marketeroftheday.com. And then the book is at WWHWbook.com.
Smart.
Nice and simple, nice and easy.
I know. You always have such good energy and good tips. I love chatting with you.
You bring it out of me.
All right. Give a hug to your adorable little son, Leo, and we'll chat again soon, I'm so sure.
All right. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.